We did not expect a predator. The announcement did not arrive with alarm sirens or emergency protocols. There was no flashing warning, no system-wide lockdown. It came quietly, too quietly, slipping into our schedules as a standard administrative update. Routine, harmless. That was the first mistake. I remember the exact moment the message pulsed through the Academy network. My sensory nodes registered it as insignificant at first, just another adjustment to class rosters. But then the words resolved, and something ancient stirred in the back of my cognition. Transfer student confirmed. Origin, Class 12 Deathworld. The corridor fell into a silence so complete it felt unnatural, like the vacuum between stars. Even before comprehension fully formed, instinct took over. The viral, whose skin shimmered with bioluminescent emotion, dimmed instantly, colors fading into muted grays of unease. The Jorvathi beside them tightened their crystalline lattices, producing faint stress fractures that clicked softly in the stillness. Across the hall, a pair of Drath, genetically engineered for warfare, ceased their conversation mid-sentence. Fear does not require translation. It spreads faster than language. A death world. The term alone carries weight across the known galaxy. Worlds where gravity crushes bone, where atmospheres poison slowly, where predators evolve not just to hunt, but to endure. Nothing civilized comes from such places, nothing stable, nothing safe. And yet our administration, beings of logic and calculation, had approved this. Cultural Integration Initiative, the notice claimed. The phrase echoed in my mind with hollow precision. Integration implies compatibility. It assumes shared parameters of existence. But death world species do not adapt to others. Others adapt to them, or they perish. From my position along the upper observation tier, I extended my perception outward, studying the reactions unfolding below. I am of the Cathari collective, observers by design, archivists of behavior. We do not panic, we analyze. And what I observed was not mere concern, it was anticipation of something wrong. Whispers began almost immediately, carried through subvocal channels and encoded signals. Fragments reached me, unverified data, speculation, myth disguised as fact. They survive structural collapse events. They can function with internal injuries. They hunt even when wounded. Some say they smile during combat. Absurd. And yet no one dismissed the rumors outright, because no one truly understood what a Class 12 death world produced. I accessed archived classifications, cross-referencing hazard indexes. Class 12 environments rank near the upper threshold of survivability, extreme gravity variances, volatile climates, constant ecological pressure. Evolution there does not reward efficiency. It rewards persistence, relentlessness, the ability to continue when continuation should be impossible. A chill, purely psychological yet undeniable, spread through my neural pathways. Then came the second transmission. Species designation, human. The word meant nothing at first. No immediate visual profile surfaced. No shared cultural database provided clarity. It was unfamiliar, undefined. That, more than anything, unsettled me. In a galaxy cataloged to near completion, obscurity is rare. Dangerous things are often the least understood. Below me, the Drath shifted uneasily. One of them, larger, heavily plated, released a low-frequency rumble. "I have heard of them," it said. That alone drew attention.
The Drath do not fear easily. They are designed for confrontation, their entire existence centered around dominance and survival. For one of them to acknowledge uncertainty. "What have you heard?" another asked. A pause. Then, quietly, "They do not stop." Silence returned, heavier this time. I processed the statement, searching for meaning beyond its simplicity. Many species persist, many endure, but something in the Drath's tone suggested this was different. Not endurance within limits, but beyond them. The corridor lights dimmed slightly as the Academy adjusted for the next cycle, casting elongated shadows across the metallic floor. It felt colder, or perhaps that was perception altering under expectation. The third and final detail arrived moments later. Transfer student assigned to physical development class. There was a delay before comprehension spread. Then, reaction. Not subtle this time. The viral skin flickered erratically, betraying panic. The Jorvathi emitted sharp crystalline chimes, distress signals. Even the Drath straightened, their posture shifting into something closer to readiness than relaxation. The gym. Of all environments, they had chosen the gym. I accessed its specifications instantly. Multi-species adaptive training chambers, variable gravity fields, resistance calibration systems, atmospheric modulators. It was designed to accommodate biological diversity safely. Safely. But safety is relative. What is controlled for one species can be catastrophic for another, and what is catastrophic for most might be baseline for a Deathworlder. The implications unfolded rapidly. If the human trained within those parameters, if those systems adjusted to them, then every other species in that room would be exposed to conditions far beyond their tolerances, not intentionally, but inevitably. A murmur spread through the hall, no longer whispers, but open concern. This is a mistake. They cannot regulate that environment for a Deathworlder. What if it adapts to them instead? What if... The thought was never completed. It did not need to be, because we all arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. The gym is where strength is measured, but more importantly, it is where weakness is revealed. And if the rumors were even partially true, if humans truly possessed the resilience described, then what we considered strength might appear as fragility in comparison. I found myself focusing on a single unsettling question. What happens when a creature that evolved under constant threat is placed in an environment designed to simulate challenge? Would it struggle, or would it thrive? The answer, I realized, would redefine not just our understanding of one species, it would redefine our understanding of limits. The Academy lights stabilized, conversations resumed, forced, uneasy, incomplete. Schedules updated, systems moved forward as they always do. But beneath that surface normalcy, something had changed. We were no longer anticipating a new student. We were anticipating an event. A variable introduced into a controlled system, an unknown force entering a space built on predictability. And as I withdrew from the observation tier, one final realization anchored itself firmly within my thoughts. We had not prepared for this, not truly, because no amount of data can simulate reality. And soon, very soon, we would witness what a Deathworlder considered exercise.
It did not arrive like a predator. There was no disruption in the Academy's systems, no surge in security presence, no environmental recalibration to accommodate something dangerous. The doors to the gym opened with their usual sterile precision, and for a brief, fragile moment, it felt as though the fears of the previous cycle had been exaggerated.
Then, the human walked in. No armor, no visible weapons, no reinforced exoskeleton or adaptive shielding, just a simple outer covering, fabric, flexible, unremarkable. Beneath it, a biological structure that at first glance seemed insufficient. I observed from my designated position, my perception narrowing instinctively. Bipedal, upright posture, balanced but not optimized for stability under extreme conditions, at least not by visible metrics. Its limbs lacked the density of the Drath, the fluid adaptability of the viral, the structural precision of the Jorvathi. Soft. That was the most unsettling detail. Its outer layer, skin, I would later confirm, showed no natural armor, no plating, no crystalline reinforcement, no visible toxins, no reactive defense mechanisms, no claws, no exposed fangs, no immediate indicators of lethality. And yet, every instinct within the room recoiled, because nothing that evolved on a Class 12 Deathworld should look harmless. The human paused just inside the entrance, scanning the room. Its head moved slightly, eyes forward-facing, locking on to individuals one by one, not in challenge, not in dominance, but in observation. Curiosity. That was the second contradiction. Predators do not enter unknown environments with curiosity. They enter with intent. The instructor, a neutral-bodied Kalaran, stepped forward with practiced composure. Their voice carried evenly across the chamber, calibrated to maintain control. Class, this is the new transfer student. Species designation, human. They will be participating in all standard physical development activities. A pause followed, not because the instructor hesitated, but because no one responded. Silence once again claimed the room. The viral remained clustered together, their skin patterns dim and tightly controlled. The Jorvathi had shifted their forms slightly backward, as if minimizing exposure. Even the Drath, positioned near the central training platforms, stood unnaturally still, watching, calculating, waiting. The human, however, did not react to the tension. It simply stood there, balanced, relaxed, breathing steady, alive in a way that felt contained. "Please introduce yourself," the instructor prompted. All attention shifted. The human stepped forward. The sound of its movement was ordinary. No heavy impacts, no exaggerated force, just controlled, measured steps against the gym's reinforced flooring. It stopped at the center, and then it spoke. "My name is Elias." The voice was calm, not artificially modulated, not projected with authority or softened with submission. It existed in a perfect equilibrium between the two. "I'm from Earth," it continued. "I look forward to training with you." That was all. No display of dominance, no attempt to assert hierarchy, no defensive posturing. Just a statement. Simple, direct, almost unfriendly. The effect was deeply unsettling, because it did not match any known behavioral pattern. Predators assert, prey appease. Even neutral species exhibit caution during first contact. This human did none of those things. It simply existed within the space, as though it belonged there, as though we were the unfamiliar variables. A low murmur rippled through the room, barely audible but present. Confusion began to override fear, if only slightly. "Is this it?" a viral whispered, their skin patterns flickering faintly. "It shows no threat display," a Jorvathi noted, their crystalline structure resonating with analytical tones. "Deception," a Drath growled quietly. "It conceals its capacity." I found myself agreeing with the last assessment, because the absence of visible threat did not reduce danger. It obscured it. The instructor resumed control, gesturing toward the training zones. We will proceed with standard orientation protocols. Pair assignments will follow. No one moved, not immediately. The idea of proximity, of interaction, was met with silent resistance. The instructor's posture stiffened slightly. This is not optional. Reluctantly, the class began to shift. Distances were maintained, pathways adjusted to avoid crossing too close to the human's position. Except for the human itself. It moved naturally among us, not aggressively, not cautiously, simply efficiently. At one point, it passed within close proximity of a viral cluster. The viral recoiled instinctively, their skin flashing a sharp warning pattern. The human stopped, turned slightly, and then it stepped back, creating space, not out of fear, but consideration. Another contradiction. Predators do not yield space, they take it. Yet this one adjusted its behavior for others. Why? The question lingered unresolved. As the session continued, I focused on the human's micro-behaviors, subtle shifts in posture, controlled breathing rhythms, muscle engagement beneath the surface. Everything about it suggested restraint, not weakness, restraint, as though its full capabilities were intentionally suppressed, concealed beneath a layer of calm normalcy, as though what we were seeing was not its true state. Time passed. Orientation protocols concluded with minimal interaction, no incidents, no displays of aggression. By all measurable standards, the session was uneventful. And yet, the tension never dissipated, because uncertainty remained. And uncertainty breeds fear more effectively than any visible threat. The instructor moved to conclude the session, their tone returning to formal structure. Next cycle, we will begin full physical evaluation. All students will participate in gym-based performance assessments. A routine statement, expected, necessary. But in that moment, it carried a different weight. Because now, there was a new variable. All eyes, every sensory organ, every perception node shifted toward the human, waiting for a reaction, for a sign, for anything that might reveal what lay beneath that calm exterior. The human did not speak. It did not shift into a defensive stance. It did not display excitement in any conventional sense. But something changed, subtle, almost imperceptible. Its posture straightened slightly, its breathing deepened, and then its facial structure shifted. The corners of its mouth curved upward. A small movement, insignificant by most standards, but in that moment it felt like a fracture in reality itself, because the expression was not neutral. It was not cautious. It was not restrained. It was anticipation. The human was not afraid of the gym. It was not concerned about the evaluation. It was not even uncertain. It was looking forward to it. A cold realization settled across my thoughts, spreading outward like a slow, inevitable wave. We had spent cycles fearing what a Deathworlder might do under pressure, but we had failed to consider something far more disturbing. What if pressure is where it thrived? The session ended. Students dispersed. Conversations resumed in hushed, fragmented tones. But the image remained fixed in my mind. That expression, that quiet, unmistakable signal of intent. Not aggression, not dominance. Something else. Something worse. Expectation. And as I processed that final detail, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. We were not preparing to test the human. The human was preparing to be tested, and it was eager to begin.
The gym was never meant for something like this. It was a place of balance, precision engineered to accommodate the fragile diversity of the galaxy. Every surface, every field, every invisible adjustment was designed with one purpose: controlled exertion without catastrophic failure. Limits were calculated, stress was measured, pain was avoided. For us, the gym was where we approached our boundaries carefully. For the human, I would soon learn, it was something else entirely. The chamber activated as the session began. Gravity stabilizers hummed softly, environmental regulators adjusting to a neutral baseline. The instructor stood at the center, posture rigid, movements sharper than before. There was hesitation, not visible to all, but to me, it was unmistakable. "Baseline evaluations will begin," the instructor announced. "All participants will proceed in assigned order." The sequence started with the viral. Gravity increased incrementally. At first, their movements remained fluid, their bioluminescent skin maintaining steady patterns. But as the force intensified, their structure began to falter. Limbs trembled, their luminous glow flickered erratically. "Threshold reached," the system reported. The viral collapsed gently, assisted by stabilizing fields. Normal, expected. Next, the Jorvathi, pressure resistance testing. Their crystalline forms held initially, facets gleaming under controlled strain. But then, sharp, brittle sounds, microfracture spread across their surfaces, stress lines visible even to untrained perception. Structural integrity compromised. They withdrew immediately. Again, normal, predictable. Even the Drath, engineered for conflict, demonstrated limits. Under extended load, their movements slowed, musculature strained visibly, respiration patterns became erratic. Stabilization required. They stepped back, not defeated, but contained. This was the purpose of the gym: to identify limits, to respect them, to survive within them. And then, it was the human's turn. A shift moved through the room, subtle but undeniable. Conversation ceased, movement stilled. Even the ambient hum of the chamber seemed quieter. The human stepped forward, calm, unhurried, as if approaching something familiar. The instructor hesitated. It was brief, less than a second, but it existed. Their appendage hovered over the control interface, uncertainty flickering across their posture. Then, with visible restraint, they initiated the sequence. Gravity increase 1.5 standard. The field adjusted. For most species, this alone would be sufficient to induce strain. The human did not react. No shift in posture, no change in breathing, nothing. A pause. Then, gravity increase 2.0 standard. A dangerous level, not prohibited, but rarely used. The chamber responded instantly. The air itself seemed to thicken, invisible pressure pressing downward with relentless consistency. All eyes fixed on the human, waiting, measuring, anticipating failure. The human stood still for a moment. Then, it took a step. The sound echoed, not loudly, but with a density that felt wrong. Each movement carried weight, not just physical, but perceptual. The floor absorbed the impact, yet the resonance lingered, traveling through the structure like a distant tremor. Another step, then another. Walking, under conditions that strained even war species. Walking, as if testing the sensation. The instructor's posture tightened. "Begin movement trial," they commanded. The human tilted its head slightly, and then it ran.
The shift was instantaneous, from stillness to motion in a single fluid transition. No visible preparation, no hesitation. Acceleration. Each footfall struck the ground with controlled force, rapid and precise. The impacts came in rhythmic succession. Thud, 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 like measured detonations contained beneath the surface. Sensors reacted immediately. Velocity exceeding projected parameters. Muscular output beyond baseline estimates. Cardiovascular, a pause. Within normal range. That last detail sent a ripple through the observers. Normal? Impossible. The human continued, completing the circuit with consistent speed. No visible degradation, no loss of control. It slowed naturally, stopped, and looked toward the instructor. Waiting, not fatigued, not strained. Waiting. Confusion began to replace fear, because this did not align with any known model. The instructor moved quickly to the next phase, strength assessment. Heavy mass units were deployed, objects calibrated specifically to challenge the draft, dense, inert, resistant. The human approached. It crouched slightly, positioning itself before the first unit. A pause. Then it lifted. No visible struggle, no gradual strain. The mass rose smoothly, controlled, as if its weight were negotiable. The human held it for a moment, then lowered it. Again and again. Repetition, consistent, measured. The system monitored closely. Load stability maintained. Muscle fiber stress minimal. Fatigue indicators. Another pause. Absent. A low murmur spread through the chamber. This was no longer confusion. This was disbelief. The human moved to a heavier unit, then another. Each time the result remained the same. Effort existed, but only in form, not in consequence. The instructor's composure began to fracture. Continue, though their tone lacked certainty. The human complied. Of course it did, because to it, this was not a test. It was routine. And then it happened. A shift, subtle but real. As the human lifted one of the heavier units, its movement faltered, just for a moment, a slight imbalance, a deviation in control. The mass dipped unexpectedly. Gasps erupted across the chamber. There it was. Weakness, proof that limits existed. The human's foot adjusted abruptly to compensate, but the increased gravity amplified the motion. Its stance destabilized, and for a fraction of a second, it stumbled. The weight dropped partially, striking the platform with a sharp, resonant impact. Silence followed. Complete. Absolute. The human remained still, head lowered slightly, breathing, now heavier than before. At last, something real, something understandable. It had reached its limit. It had to stop. But then, a sound broke the silence. Soft, unexpected. The human laughed. Not loudly, not mockingly, just a quiet exhale of sound, almost amused. It adjusted its grip, repositioned its stance, and lifted again. The motion was slower this time, deliberate, strained, but it continued, despite the failure, despite the instability, despite the clear signal that it had reached the edge of its capacity. It continued, repetition after repetition, each one imperfect, each one harder, but none of them final. I felt something shift within my perception, a recalibration, because this was not endurance as we understood it. This was something else. The human was not avoiding its limit. It was engaging with it, pushing into it, through it, as if the boundary itself was the objective. As if pain is irrelevant, a Jorvathi whispered, their voice trembling. No, I corrected internally. Not irrelevant. Accepted. Used. The human completed the final repetition and lowered the weight carefully. Its breathing was now visibly elevated. Muscles trembled slightly beneath its outer layer. But its posture remained upright, unbroken. It stepped back, and once again, it smiled. Not with ease this time, but with satisfaction. That was the moment everything changed. Fear did not disappear. It evolved. Because what we had witnessed was not just strength, not just resilience, but intent. The deliberate choice to continue beyond comfort, beyond safety, beyond reason. The instructor said nothing. They could not. The data spoke clearly enough. And yet, it explained nothing, because there was no framework.
We believed we had already seen everything. That illusion did not last. The gem did not reset between revelations. It escalated. After the strength trials, a quiet tension lingered in the chamber. Data streams continued to scroll across the instructor's interface, but there was a delay now, a hesitation that had not existed before. The human had disrupted expectation, and now the system itself seemed uncertain how to proceed. But protocol is rigid, and protocol demanded completion. Endurance trials will begin, the instructor announced, their voice carrying less certainty than before. A low reaction rippled through the class. Endurance testing was different. Strength had limits that could be measured in discrete units: mass, force, repetition. Endurance was something else. It was time. Suffering extended across duration, and for most species, it was where failure became inevitable. The chamber responded instantly. Environmental controls shifted. Temperature began to rise, slowly at first, then steadily. Atmospheric density adjusted. Oxygen levels decreased incrementally, forcing biological systems to compensate. Resistance fields activated, adding constant drag to every movement. The combined effect was immediate. The viral faltered within moments, their skin patterns destabilizing under thermal stress. Their respiration became erratic as oxygen levels dropped. Threshold reached. They were removed from the trial. The Jorvathi lasted longer, but not by much. Heat expansion caused microfractures to spread rapidly through their crystalline forms. Structural integrity warnings escalated. Withdrawal required. They complied. Even the Drath, engineered for sustained combat, showed strain. Their movements grew heavier under the compounded resistance. Respiration intensified. Muscular efficiency degraded. Minutes passed. Then they stopped. Not by choice, by necessity. Endurance limit achieved. The chamber stabilized slightly as each participant exited the active field, one by one, until only a single figure remained at the center. The human, of course. At first, there was nothing extraordinary about its state. Its breathing had deepened. Its posture had shifted slightly to compensate for the resistance. Perspiration, liquid cooling, I would later understand, formed across its skin. All expected responses, all within predicted biological behavior. But then, time continued, and the human did not stop. The instructor monitored closely now, their attention fully locked onto the data stream. Duration exceeding class average, the system noted. That was an understatement. Minutes stretched, then extended, then became something else entirely. The environment grew harsher. Heat climbed to levels that forced even passive observers to recalibrate their perception filters. Oxygen dipped further, inducing stress responses across every species present, even those no longer participating. The human remained. Its breathing grew heavier now, audible,
rhythmic, controlled, each inhale deliberate, each exhale measured, not panicked, not erratic, controlled. That detail mattered because control implies awareness, and awareness implies choice. The human knew exactly what it was experiencing, and it was choosing to continue. Recommend termination, the system suggested. The instructor hesitated, again, but this time they did not act immediately. Perhaps they wanted to see it, the limit, the inevitable point of failure. Because everything fails, everything breaks. That is the foundation of all biological systems, even Deathworlders, even humans. I focused my perception more tightly, analyzing every detail. Microtremors had begun in the human musculature, small involuntary contractions beneath the surface, signs of fatigue accumulation. Thermal readings indicated rising internal temperature. Oxygen deprivation markers were present, though not yet critical. All signals pointed to the same conclusion. It was approaching its limit. And then, something changed. Subtle, but unmistakable. The human's posture shifted. Not downward, not into collapse, but forward, as if leaning into the pressure. Its breathing pattern adjusted, faster now, but still controlled. Its stance widened slightly, redistributing weight against the resistance field. And then, it moved. Not required, not instructed. Movement was not part of the endurance trial. This phase measured survival, not activity. But the human began to push against the resistance, slow, deliberate steps forward. Each movement required effort, visible effort. Muscles tightened, strain became evident, but it continued. Unnecessary exertion detected, the system reported. No response. Energy conservation recommended. No response. The human took another step, then another. Against rising heat, against thinning oxygen, against resistance that grew heavier with every passing second. Why? The question echoed through my cognition. Why expend more energy when survival requires less? Why push further when the objective is simply to endure? The answer did not come from the data. It came from observation, from expression. The human's face, previously calm, controlled, had changed, not into fear, not into distress, but into something far more intense. Focus, determination, a quiet, unwavering refusal to yield. This was not survival. This was pursuit. The human was not enduring the environment. It was challenging it. Warning, muscular strain exceeding optimal thresholds. Micro-tears began to register across the system's diagnostics, muscle fibers breaking down under sustained stress, damage accumulating faster than recovery. For any other species, this would trigger immediate shutdown. Pain would override intention. The body would force cessation. But the human ignored it, or perhaps accepted it. Another step, slower now, heavier, but taken. Warning, systemic stress approaching critical levels. Still, it continued. The chamber had grown oppressive, the combined environmental factors pushing far beyond standard training limits. And yet, at the center, the human moved. Each step a deliberate act of defiance against biology itself. I felt something unfamiliar within my processing layers. Not fear, not distress, but something far deeper. Something that bordered on disbelief. Because this was no longer within any model of behavior I understood. This was not rational. This was not efficient. This was not survivable in the long term. And yet, it was happening. The instructor's control appendage hovered over the termination command. Endurance trial complete, they began. But stopped, because the human had not stopped.
It pushed further, one more step, then another, its movements now visibly strained, stability compromised, muscular control degrading. It should have collapsed, it should have failed, it should have ended, but it did not, because it did not want to. That realization struck with unsettling clarity. This was not about limits, it was about surpassing them. Critical threshold reached, immediate shutdown required. This time, the instructor did not hesitate. The command was executed. Instantly, the chamber shifted. Temperature dropped. Oxygen levels normalized. Resistance fields disengaged. The oppressive force vanished. And the human collapsed. Not completely, not into failure, but on one knee. Its body trembled slightly, the accumulated strain finally manifesting without the resistance field to counterbalance it. Silence filled the chamber, all attention locked onto that single figure, waiting, measuring, interpreting. The human remained there for a moment, breathing heavily now. Deep, controlled inhales, slow, deliberate exhales, recovering, not broken, never broken. And then it lifted its head and smiled, not weakly, not with relief, but with satisfaction, as if the experience had been worthwhile. That was the moment understanding began to form, not complete, not fully realized, but undeniable. This species does not fear breaking. It does not avoid the edge of its limits. It seeks them, finds them, and then pushes beyond. Pain.
It began as routine. That, perhaps, was the most dangerous part. There were no warnings embedded in the schedule, no predictive anomalies flagged by the system. The gym initialized as it always did, precise, controlled, reliable. Environmental fields calibrated, gravity stabilized, safety thresholds locked into place. Normal, predictable, safe. We had begun to adapt. That realization alone should have concerned me more than it did at the time. The presence of the human no longer triggered immediate panic. Distance was still maintained, yes, but not with the same urgency. Observations had replaced avoidance. Curiosity had begun to erode fear. Even I had adjusted. I was no longer anticipating catastrophe. I was studying it. The session started with synchronized movement drills, low-intensity coordination exercises designed to improve multi-species adaptability. The instructor guided us through standard sequences, controlled pacing, minimal strain. The human followed without deviation, not exceeding expectations, not drawing attention, contained, disciplined. That too was unsettling in its own way, because it meant control, and control implies choice. Everything remained stable until it didn't. The shift was instantaneous. A distortion rippled through the chamber, not visible but felt. The kind of disruption that bypasses conscious processing and strikes directly at instinct. Then, impact. Not external, internal. Gravity surged, not incrementally, not controlled. A violent spike far beyond calibrated limits. The floor struck upward with crushing force. Bodies collapsed instantly under the sudden increase. Structures that were stable moments before failed without warning. The virel flattened against the ground, their forms unable to compensate. The Jorvathi fractured audibly, crystalline surfaces splintering under the pressure. Even the Droth, built for combat, were driven to their knees, their reinforced musculature unable to withstand the abrupt overload. Panic erupted, not in sound alone, but in signal, in movement, in raw, unfiltered biological response. System error, gravity regulation failure. Warning, overload threshold exceeded. Emergency stabilization offline.
The alerts overlapped, fragmented, incomplete. For most of us, movement became impossible. The pressure pressed down with relentless intensity, compressing limbs, restricting respiration. Breathing became shallow, ineffective. Every attempt to rise resulted in failure. We were pinned, helpless. The gym, our controlled environment, had become a crushing trap. And in that moment, survival instincts activated. Not collective, individual. Each species focused inward, prioritizing self-preservation. That is the natural response. That is what evolution teaches. But then, there was the human. At first, it did not move. Its body had been forced downward like all others, impact driving it toward the floor. For a fraction of a second, it remained there, still, compressed under the same overwhelming force. Then, it pushed. The motion was slow, painfully slow. Its arms trembled as they pressed against the surface, muscles strained visibly beneath its skin. Every movement looked wrong. Not because it was ineffective, but because it should not have been possible. The gravity field had exceeded safe operational limits. Even the Droth could not rise. And yet, the human forced itself upward. A low, strained exhale escaped it, not a cry of distress, but effort made audible. Its limbs shook under the load, joints resisting the unnatural pressure. But it did not stop. It reached one knee, paused, adjusted, then stood. Not fully stable, not effortlessly, but standing. A figure upright against a force that had crushed everything else into submission. My perception struggled to process it. This was no longer training. This was survival under catastrophic conditions. And the human was moving. It took a step. The floor groaned faintly under the combined pressure and force of movement. Another step. Slower, more unstable, but controlled. It looked painful. Not simulated pain, not measured discomfort. Real. Its body was under stress far beyond safe thresholds. Micro damage would be occurring at every level, muscular, skeletal, systemic. The system confirmed it. Warning, critical strain detected. Structural damage imminent. Recommend immediate cessation of movement. The human ignored all of it. Because it was not moving away from danger. It was moving toward us. That realization struck with disorienting clarity. It was not seeking safety. It was approaching others. The first to receive assistance was a Virel. Their body had flattened under the pressure, respiration shallow and unstable. They lacked the structural strength to resist the force. The human reached them, lowered itself slowly, carefully into a crouch that visibly strained its entire frame. Then it lifted. Not entirely, not enough to free them completely, but enough. Enough to reduce pressure, enough to allow breath. The Virel skin flickered weakly as airflow returned. The human held that position for a moment, then shifted, moved again, to the next. A Jorvathi, their crystalline form fractured, unable to reassemble under the load. The human applied force, not precise, not delicate by their standards, but effective, stabilizing, preventing further collapse. Then, again, another, and another. Each movement slower than the last, each action requiring more effort. Its body was beginning to fail. That much was clear. Tremors increased, stability decreased, breathing grew harsher, less controlled. The signs were undeniable. It was reaching its limit. But unlike before, it did not stop. Because this was not training. This was not self-imposed challenge. This was something else. Something I could not immediately categorize.
We expected recovery to take cycles. That was the first assumption. A logical one based on every known biological framework in the registry. After what had occurred in the gym, after catastrophic overload, systemic strain, and full body stabilization failure, the subject should have required extended medical isolation, minimal stimulation, complete recovery protocols, possibly even long-term support structuring. That is what any species would require. That is what we would require. But the human did not comply with expectation. It returned the next day. At first, I thought it was a recording error, a misclassification in identity tracking, a duplication in system logs, because what stood before us could not have been the same individual. And yet, it was. The same human, Elias, walking under its own power, present, not fully recovered. That much was immediately clear. Its movements lacked the sharp efficiency observed during initial sessions. There was subtle stiffness in posture, minor irregularities in gait. Micro-signals of fatigue still lingered in its system. And yet, it stood among us again, as if yesterday had not been catastrophic, as if yesterday had not pushed it to collapse, as if yesterday had been acceptable. The instructor paused longer than usual before beginning the session. Even they were recalibrating. The room itself felt different, not structurally, but psychologically. There was an absence of certainty now, replaced by something far more difficult to manage. Expectation had broken. In its place, uncertainty remained. The human did not offer explanation for its condition. It simply took its place within the formation as if nothing unusual had occurred. That silence did not last long. During a brief interval between exercises, a Jorvathi, one of the more analytically inclined species present, finally voiced what many were thinking. "Your recovery cycle is incomplete," they stated, their crystalline tone carrying precise measurement rather than accusation. The human tilted its head slightly, paused, then responded. Simple, direct. "We get stronger that way." The words did not register immediately. They should have been meaningless, or metaphorical at best. But something about the way they were spoken suggested certainty rather than casual remark. The Jorvathi processed the phrase repeatedly. "Stronger from damage?" they asked. The human nodded once. Yes. That was it. No elaboration, no justification, just confirmation. And in that moment, a fundamental disconnect revealed itself. Because in every known biological system, damage is an error state, a deviation, a failure condition to be corrected, repaired, minimized, not encouraged, not repeated, not pursued. Yet the human spoke of it as if it were beneficial, as if injury was not an endpoint, but a mechanism. I reviewed archived biological frameworks, searching for parallels. There were none. Even the most aggressive adaptive species avoided harm unless survival demanded it. Humans appeared to operate under an entirely different logic.
one not centered on avoidance, but on exposure. The session resumed, but focus had shifted. No longer on performance metrics, not on comparison, but on observation. The human moved through the drills again, slower than before, more deliberate, yet still controlled, still consistent, still present. I observed closely, scanning for signs of degradation. They were there. Minor strain indicators persisted in muscle groups previously overstressed, subtle compensatory adjustments in movement patterns, reduced explosive output. And yet, there was no regression, no decline in function, only adaptation. It was as if the damage had not merely healed, but been incorporated. During a transition period, I observed the human interacting with others more directly than before. A viral struggled with a coordination sequence, their movements destabilized by lingering fatigue from previous sessions. The instructor had not yet intervened. The human stepped closer. Not abruptly, not intrusively, just enough to assist. It demonstrated the movement slowly. Once, then again. The viral attempted to replicate it, failed. The human adjusted positioning, demonstrated again. Patient, unhurried. There was no superiority in its posture, no dominance display, no indication of hierarchy enforcement, only assistance. The viral succeeded on the third attempt. Their skin patterns stabilized in response, not fear, but relief. The human nodded once and moved on. Later, I observed a similar interaction with a Drath unit. This time, the exchange involved resistance adjustment techniques, methods to redistribute load during high-stress movement sequences. Again, no assertion of superiority, only transfer of knowledge. What unsettled me most was not the content of the interactions, but the absence of expectation behind them. The human did not seem to be gaining advantage from these exchanges. It was not collecting leverage, not building dominance, not establishing control. It was participating. That word felt inadequate, but no alternative presented itself. During a brief observation window, I approached the instructor directly. "Is the subject stable?" I asked. The instructor hesitated before responding. A rare occurrence. "Biologically, no," they said. "Recovery indicators are incomplete. Stress markers remain elevated." A pause. Then, "Functionally, yes." That contradiction lingered. Biologically unstable, functionally stable. I reviewed the classification repeatedly. It did not resolve. Later, during a rest interval, I observed the human alone. It sat quietly at the edge of the training platform, gaze directed downward, not in exhaustion alone, but in reflection. Its breathing was steady now, not fully recovered, but controlled. A Drath approached cautiously. There was no aggression in its movement, only inquiry. "You returned early," it stated. The human glanced up. "Yes." "Why?" the Drath asked. A pause. The human considered the question, not as though translating language, but as though selecting meaning. Then it answered, "Because stopping doesn't help." The Drath tilted its head slightly. "Stopping is recovery," it said. The human nodded once. "Recovery helps you start again." Another pause. Then quietly, "We just don't like starting from the same place." That statement lingered longer than expected, because it implied continuity, progression, accumulation, not reset, not restoration, but advancement, through persistence of damage. The draft did not respond immediately. Neither did I, because the concept was incompatible with known biological optimization strategies. And yet, it was being demonstrated, continuously. The session ended without incident. As participants dispersed, I remained behind briefly, reviewing recorded metrics. The data was consistent. No anomalies in measurement. No system errors. No misinterpretation. Everything the human had done was real. And yet, reality itself felt misaligned. As I prepared my report, one conclusion became unavoidable. The human did not avoid harm. It incorporated it. It did not fear damage. It transformed it. And that distinction changed everything. Because a species that improves through injury does not merely survive its environment, it evolves through it. And as I finalized my notes, another realization followed, quiet but persistent. We had been studying the human as if it were adapting to us. But in truth, it was not adapting at all. It was simply revealing what it already was. And that was far more unsettling than any unknown predator. Because predators—
The gym did not change. Its structure remained identical. Unchanged alloys, stable gravity systems, predictable environmental controls. Every calibration routine ran as it always had. And yet, everything felt different. I recorded the first noticeable deviation during a standard warm-up cycle. Where once there had been hesitation, careful spacing between species, deliberate avoidance of proximity, there was now movement. Not reckless, not unified, but exploratory, as if the barrier between self and others had softened. Curiosity had begun to replace fear. It was not immediate, not sudden. It accumulated slowly, like pressure building in a sealed system. The viral no longer clustered exclusively among their own kind. Their movements extended outward, testing shared space with caution rather than avoidance. The Jorvathy began adjusting technique through observation rather than isolation. Even the Drath, once rigid in their self-contained discipline, shifted subtly toward external comparison. And at the center of it all, the human, Elias. It did not dominate the space. It did not command attention. It simply existed within it. But its presence had become influential, not through force, not through authority, but through example. Training intensity increased across all groups, not as competition. That would be inaccurate. There was no attempt to surpass the human directly. That idea had already been abandoned after earlier sessions revealed the futility of comparison. Instead, they were trying to understand it, to map it, to replicate the underlying logic behind its behavior. I observed a viral repeating endurance drills beyond their previous threshold, not because they were instructed to, but because they were attempting to reproduce the human's recovery pattern. I observed a Jorvathy deliberately extending controlled stress exposure, carefully monitoring structural response as if searching for the point at which adaptation begins. Even the Drath engaged in extended observation cycles, analyzing movement efficiency rather than raw output. The human had become a reference point, not of superiority, but of possibility. And that distinction mattered. Because superiority creates distance, possibility creates pursuit. The human, for its part, adapted as well, but in a different way. It slowed, not in capability, but in execution. Where once it moved with efficient intensity, it now matched the tempo of others, adjusted force output, reduced unnecessary strain. Its presence became less overwhelming, more accessible. It began assisting without prompting,
demonstrating movement sequences with clarity rather than speed, breaking down complex drills into repeatable steps, offering corrections when requested but never imposed. It did not lead by command, it led by participation. One instance stood out clearly in my records. A viral struggling with a resistance stabilization sequence hesitated mid-motion, their form destabilizing under moderate load. Before the instructor could intervene, the human approached. It did not take control of the exercise. It adjusted position beside them, then demonstrated, not faster, not stronger, but slower, deliberate, precise. It matched their limitations rather than exceeding them. The viral succeeded moments later. No acknowledgement of hierarchy occurred, only continuation. That pattern repeated across cycles: assistance without dominance, guidance without enforcement, presence without pressure. It was leadership, though the term feels insufficient, because leadership implies intention, direction, hierarchy. The human displayed none of these in explicit form, and yet the effect was undeniable. Even the Drath, initially dismissive of all external influence, began altering training observation patterns. They watched the human more closely now, not as anomaly, but as reference, as variable, as data point worth integrating. One of them was overheard stating, "Its recovery efficiency is inconsistent, but its adaptation rate is informative," a statement that in any other context would have been reductive. Here, it was respect disguised as analysis. I noted something more subtle during observational review. The human no longer appeared isolated within the dataset. Its actions were increasingly interconnected with others. A feedback loop had formed. Others adapted in response to it. It adapted in response to them, not competitively, but collaboratively. A dynamic shift had occurred within the gym's ecosystem, and yet no formal structure had changed, no instruction had been issued, no directive had been given. The transformation was entirely emergent, self-organized, organic. That realization carried weight, because systems that evolve without central control are rarely predictable and rarely reversible. During a brief interval, I observed the human pausing between drills. It was speaking with a small group of mixed-species trainees. The tone was light, something resembling humor present in its expression, a concept previously absent from its earlier interactions. The others responded, not with fear, not with awe, but with engagement. They were learning from it, and it, in turn, was learning from them. The separation between observer and participant had begun to dissolve. I found myself reconsidering earlier classifications. The human was not simply a stimulus, not merely an anomaly within a controlled environment. It was becoming a center of gravity within the system, not imposed, but earned. That distinction repeated in my processing cycles. Earned, not enforced, not assigned. Earned. As the session concluded, the class dispersed with less rigidity than before. Movement patterns were more fluid, less defensive. Conversations persisted beyond designated boundaries, and the human walked among them, not ahead, not behind, within. That, perhaps, was the most significant shift, because fear had once defined distance. Now, understanding defined proximity. And as I compiled the final observations of the cycle, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to ignore. The human had not changed the gym. It had changed what the gym meant. And in doing so, it had changed us.
The final assessment report was not difficult to begin. It was difficult to complete. Not because of missing data, not because of contradictory evidence, but because every classification I attempted collapsed under its own inadequacy. I began, as protocol dictated, with established biological categorization frameworks:
predator, survivor, adaptive organism, anomaly. Each term was applied, each term rejected, not by error, but by insufficiency. The human, Elias, did not fit within any singular classification because it did not operate within a singular survival strategy. Predator implied dominance through external removal of threats. Survivor implied endurance through passive resistance. Adaptive organism implied gradual modification within environmental constraints. But what we had observed was not exclusive to any one of these behaviors. It was all of them, and more. The human was a predator when required, not through constant aggression, but through decisive action when thresholds were met, efficient, immediate, without hesitation. The human was a survivor in conditions that should have rendered survival statistically improbable. Structural strain that exceeded baseline tolerance, recovery cycles that remained incomplete, and yet function continued. But most importantly, the human was something else entirely when neither survival nor dominance was necessary. It was constructive. It improved, not in response to stability, but in response to instability. That distinction became the center of my analysis, because within our biological models, stress is a cost function, a degradation variable, a factor to be minimized or eliminated. In the human model, stress is input, not loss, conversion material. The deeper I reviewed the data, the more consistent the pattern became. Muscle degradation followed by increased baseline strength, cognitive strain followed by improved task efficiency, emotional pressure followed by enhanced social cohesion behaviors. Even failure, actual measurable failure within training sequences, did not produce regression, it produced recalibration. The system did not break, it restructured, and each restructuring improved performance ceilings beyond prior limits. I attempted to model this within known evolutionary frameworks. The closest analogs were extremophile organisms, species that survive under hostile environmental conditions, radiation tolerance, pressure resistance, thermal adaptation. But even those systems prioritize survival above change. They endure the environment. They do not intentionally seek it. Humans, however, appear to engage with stress not as a threat, but as a mechanism, a tool, a resource, and that is where classification fails entirely. Because every known species optimizes for stability within survivable bounds, humans appear to optimize for expansion beyond them. I paused several times during compilation of the report, not due to uncertainty in data, but due to the implications forming between data sets, patterns that should not coexist within a single biological strategy, patterns that should not be sustainable, and yet they were. I reviewed incident logs from the gym once more. The same conclusion repeated across multiple observers, across multiple species perspectives. The human improves under pressure, not occasionally, not conditionally, consistently, predictably. That consistency is what removed it from anomaly classification. Anomalies are irregular. The human was not irregular. It was systematic. And systems, once understood, imply scalability. That thought introduced a new variable into the analysis. If one human demonstrates this pattern, what defines the limits of the species? I attempted to isolate environmental variables that might suppress this behavior. Reduced stress exposure, increased recovery intervals, elimination of physical strain, psychological stabilization protocols. In every simulated adjustment, the result remained unchanged. When stress decreased, growth slowed, but did not reverse. When stress increased within tolerable bounds, growth accelerated. The system was not dependent on extreme conditions, it was responsive to them. This adaptability was not fragile, it was resilient. And resilience, when combined with improvement under pressure, produces a compound effect that traditional classification systems do not account for. A species that does not merely withstand its environment, but is refined by it. As I reached the conclusion section of the report, I attempted one final categorization: predator, partially accurate; survivor, incomplete but applicable; adaptive organism, insufficient. None were adequate alone. All were partially correct together. But even combined, they failed to describe the full mechanism at work. So I left the classification blank, and instead wrote a descriptive statement. Humans do not simply endure harsh environments, they evolve within them. Then I paused, because that sentence was still incomplete. It implied passivity. So I revised it. Humans do not merely endure harsh environments, they evolve through them. Even that felt insufficient. Finally, I settled on the version that remained in the report. Humans take stress, physical, emotional, systemic, and convert it into progression. That is their operational signature. That is their adaptation model. That is their advantage. And that is their risk. Because a species that improves under pressure does not degrade in the way others do, it compounds. The final section of the report required assessment of threat classification. I hesitated longer there than anywhere else, not due to fear, but due to perspective shift. Because threat implies opposition, but what I was now considering was not opposition, it was trajectory. A species that grows stronger through adversity cannot be reliably suppressed through conventional means. Containment becomes temporary, suppression becomes fuel, resistance becomes reinforcement. As I finalized the document, a final realization emerged: quiet, precise, unavoidable. We had initially classified the human as an anomaly within a controlled training environment, then as an adaptive participant, then as an emergent influence within a social system, but none of those were correct. Not individually, not collectively, because we were never observing a deviation from baseline. We were observing the baseline itself. The gym had not revealed something unusual about the human. It had revealed something fundamental about humanity. And as I transmitted the final report to Central Archives, one concluding thought remained unspoken within the formal text, but fully present within my processing core. We were not studying a dangerous individual. We were studying what happens when a species refuses to stop growing.
When the human first arrived, we recorded it as a potential risk factor. That was the language used. Risk factor. A controlled designation for an unknown variable introduced into a stable system. At the time, it felt appropriate, even necessary. We had no reference point for what we were observing, only behavior that consistently violated expected biological constraints. Only responses that refused to align with established models of fatigue, recovery, and limitation. So we did what all cautious systems do. We labeled it, we contained it, we observed it. And in the early cycles, fear was the dominant interpretive lens. Not fear in the emotional sense alone, but structural fear. The kind that emerges when predictive models begin to fail, when outputs no longer match inputs, when systems stop behaving as systems should. The human created that disruption, not through aggression, but through persistence. It did not overwhelm the gym. It did not break protocols. It did not challenge authority. It simply continued. That, more than anything, unsettled us. Because every known danger eventually exhausts itself.
Every threat has a cost curve. Every aggressive system eventually collapses under sustained resistance or internal degradation. But the human did not follow that curve. It extended beyond it, again and again. As cycles passed, something changed in our interpretation. Fear did not disappear, but it transformed. It was replaced, gradually, not by comfort, but by comprehension. We began to understand the pattern beneath the anomaly, and what we found was not randomness, not instability, but structure. The human was not unpredictable, it was unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity is often mistaken for chaos until enough data reveals the underlying order. We had assumed the human was extraordinary because it exceeded limits, but that was not entirely accurate. It exceeded limits because it treated limits as temporary states, not endpoints, not barriers, but transitional phases. Yes, the human is strong. That much is undeniable. Its physical resilience alone surpasses baseline expectations for multiple recorded species within the station's registry. Yes, it is resilient. It absorbs strain that would incapacitate most known organisms and returns, not unchanged, but improved. Yes, it is, by conventional interpretation, terrifying, but not in the way predators are terrifying, not in the way weapons are terrifying, not in the way collapse or extinction is terrifying. The human is terrifying in a quieter sense, a more fundamental one, because it does not stop, even when it should, even when systems fail, even when recovery is incomplete, even when logic dictates cessation, it continues. And continuation, when paired with adaptation, produces something unprecedented. Over time, that realization reframed everything we thought we understood. Strength was no longer just force output. Resilience was no longer just survival duration. Endurance was no longer just resistance to failure. For the human, these were not separate traits. They were expressions of the same mechanism, a mechanism that converts pressure into progress, failure into refinement, breakdown into iteration. And in that reframing, fear began to lose its original shape, because fear requires an unknown that resists understanding. But the human, once understood, did not become less significant. It became more coherent, more structured, more instructive. We stopped asking how to contain it and started asking what it meant, not as a threat, but as a model. Because something began to emerge from the accumulated observations across all sessions, all species, all interpretations within the gym. A pattern that extended beyond individual capability, beyond training protocols, beyond environmental adaptation. A pattern that suggested continuity beyond adversity. A pattern that suggested progression as default behavior. And in that realization, something unexpected occurred within our collective interpretation systems. Fear did not vanish, but it evolved. It became something closer to recognition, and then something even more difficult to categorize: hope. Not hope in the emotional sense alone, but structural hope. The possibility that limitation is not final, that breakdown is not ending, that survival is not the ceiling of existence, but the beginning of something beyond it. Because if one species can turn suffering into advancement, then suffering is no longer simply an obstacle, it is a resource. And in a galaxy defined by caution, by systems built to avoid loss, minimize risk, and preserve equilibrium, the human introduces a different equation entirely. Not survival as success, not stability as achievement, but progress as identity. And as I conclude this final reflection, one thought remains, no longer uncertain, but quietly affirmed through observation, iteration, and understanding. We feared the human when they arrived, but what we learned from them changed what fear means. Because they do not merely survive the galaxy, they push it forward. And that is why, moving forward, we will no longer define them as an anomaly to be managed, but as a catalyst for something we are only beginning to understand: progress.